What is up, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today's case was actually picked out by my sister. She's been helping me a lot go through all of the case suggestions, and she saw this one and it stopped her in her tracks. This video is going to be about the disappearance and death of 30-year-old Eric Haider, who was essentially buried alive. And this is actually a first on my channel. I feel like when we go through cases, we are typically looking at one person that has committed an act towards another person, and that's the only person held responsible or possibly not held responsible. But this is involving a company that is completely negligent. And despite the fact that this man was buried alive in 2012, there are still no charges. Nobody has been held responsible for this. I mean, his body was found buried underground, and somehow that's not enough for authorities or anyone, including OSHA, to do anything. The reason my sister wanted me to do this is because this man was working for a plumbing company, heating, air conditioning, and plumbing, and that is what my brother-in-law does. And they have a young daughter, and the second she saw that this man died due to company negligence, and the same job that my brother-in-law has, it devastated her. And she said, you know, this is something that's my worst nightmare. Will you please speak up for this family? So that is why I am here today. So before I get into today's video, I do need to first thank Skillshare for partnering with me on today's video. You guys know this is a company that I absolutely adore. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers thousands of inspiring classes to creative minds. It doesn't matter if you just want to pick up a new hobby, or if you want to become an expert, or if you just need to brush up on some of your skills. There are classes to meet you at every single skill level. I have personally taken classes on videography, podcasting, crochet, gardening, cooking, different like blogging things. I mean, you name it, I've taken it. I've taken art classes like calligraphy. And as someone who loves to learn everything about everything, this is a treasure trove of knowledge. Skillshare offers classes that you can take at your own pace. They're in video form and kind of like chapters, so you can skip ahead if you already know something, or do it segment at a time so it's not taking up too much of your time, or you can sit down and binge take like a million classes. It's totally up to you. Recently took a class called Productivity for Creatives: Build a System That Brings Out Your Best, by a man named Thomas Frank. And I've not mentioned it too much on my channel, except for maybe a handful of times, but I am neurodivergent, and with the job that I have, it can definitely be a struggle, to say the least. I have so much hyper focus that can happen, which can be great for this job, but at the same time, I really struggle with executive dysfunction. So keeping on task can be very difficult for me. Getting things done in a timely manner can be difficult for me. And the reason I specifically wanted to take this class is because it has a portion on setting up a workspace that works for you. And anyone else out there who is neurodivergent will know, especially if you have ADHD, that literally a paint chip in the wall can distract you for hours somehow. So if you're a creative mind that wants to expand your horizons, Skillshare has an awesome offer for you. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description box will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring away. Thank you again to Skillshare. Companies like Skillshare allow me to make the best possible donations to the families of the victims that I cover. They really support the true crime community, and I'm forever appreciative for them. So now on to the details of this case. So Eric kind of came into this world in a very difficult way, which in my opinion makes the way he went out of this world that much more devastating. So Eric was born prematurely. The doctors said that he was not expected to live. He had the cord wrapped around his neck. His knees were up by his ears. I mean, he just suffered a lot of damage. And so when he was born, no one was sure what was going to happen, but he blew everyone's mind. He ended up going through years of therapy to help straighten out his limbs. He slowly began to recover. He did end up deaf in one ear and partially deaf in the other, and his older brother would sit with him for hours and teach him how to read lips. He learned sign language, and despite this difficult, way that he came into the world, he didn't let that stop him. He was a 6-foot tall man man, absolutely full of life. He had a lot of heart issues. I believe he was born with a heart murmur, and being premature, something just wasn't working properly. But his mother said, and I quote, "He may have had a weak heart medically, but he had a heart of gold, and he cared so deeply for others." Eric was an incredibly happy and giving person. I know there's the saying, he'd give the shirt off his back, but Eric quite literally gave the shirt off of his back to a stranger who needed something nice to wear to an interview. He was the kind of kid that would bring his friends home in high school to have dinner with his family if he knew they may not get a meal that night. He was always happy, always smiling, always doing what he could for other people. He also was a huge adventurer. He loved the adrenaline rush. He actually lived in Hawaii before he was 20 years old. He would go kayaking, cliff jumping, water sports were his thing. Pretty much anything at all that involved being active and being outside. He loved fishing. He loved skiing. He was the kind of guy that was always having fun. He was also incredibly intelligent. His friends and family would often joke that you needed a dictionary when you were hanging out with him because that's the only way you could understand him. And when he was able to get a job, he took any job he possibly could. He was just a hard worker, determined individual that wanted to succeed in life. During those young years, he did end up dabbling in drugs a little bit, and he did get in trouble with the law a handful of times. But he very quickly cleaned himself up, put himself in a better place, and started pushing towards his future. When he was 20, he ended up having his first child, Bryn. That's his daughter. I know he did go on to have a second child, but I haven't seen much about him. Eric had a great relationship with his daughter. You can probably imagine, based on how I've described him, that he was a fun dad. Like, they did everything together. She remembers playing Mario Kart with him and just all of the fun they would have. But unfortunately, he still was having health issues. At the ages of 23, 25, and 27, he suffered, from my understanding, 3 heart attacks. I've also seen that he suffered 3 strokes, which is obviously something different. I'm not sure which it is, but all I know is that after that third one, by the age of 27, he had to have a pacemaker in order to keep his heart working. And he required daily medication as well. He was on blood thinners, but he didn't let this stop him. He ended up meeting a woman named Jody, and they moved in together. They were engaged to be married. He was so excited to get married for the very first time. He took in her 2 children and treated them as if they were his own. He decided that he needed to get a better paying job to set his family up for the best possible life. He ended up finding a position open at a company based out of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is where he lived. And this company was called Koffel Plumbing and Heating. And essentially, what he would be doing was dirt work, which is what he was very familiar with. He was the kind of guy, again, he wanted to work with big machinery, and he liked getting dirty when he was working. And so he was essentially going to be working commercially with this company to dig out trenches and do all these other things. And so he went in for an interview thinking this was going to be a great opportunity. And his mom, Mary Ellen, took him to this interview, and she remembered it took a very long time. And when he finally came out, he said it was the strangest interview he had ever been in. Now, as I stated before, he did have a criminal record. He had been involved in drugs. Obviously, these companies do a background check, so they were very well aware of this. He was also honest about it. So they had all this information, but he said while he was in the interview, they drilled him about it. They were asking him very strange questions. They wanted extreme details that weren't really relevant, and he thought it was weird, but again, it was a well-paying job. He wanted to set his family up before they got married, so he decided to take this job. So at the time that Eric joined the team at Koffel, his particular crew, they were working on a sewer main off of Highway 22 in Dickinson, which is a town about just an hour and a half away from Bismarck, where he lived and where the company headquarters was. And about 2 weeks into this job, and he only spent a total of 3 weeks at this job. So 2 weeks in, he told his mom and his friends that he needed to find a new job. He told them that the company was sloppy, that they did not take any responsibility for their work whatsoever. There are certain safety protocols. I know they differ from location to location, but there are certain things expected when you're doing that kind of work to keep the crew safe. And he said that wasn't being done, that they rushed through jobs. They just did the sloppiest work ever. And he said he didn't want to work in such a reckless and negligent environment. But he had a conversation with his mom, Mary Ellen. He knew that he should not quit a job before having another one lined up. And she was like, that's the best decision you can make right now. Just stick it out until you can find something new. And that was the plan. But unfortunately, he never actually had the time to do that. So on the 24th of May, 2012, Mary Ellen took Eric to work early that morning. Because the job was so far away, the crew had a meetup spot in Bismarck where they all would park their cars, and they piled into a work van and took that work van carpool style the hour and a half away to Dickinson for the job. So Mary Ellen dropped him off at the site. They said, I love you. Eric said he'd talk to her later, and he left with his crew of about 6 people. Now, usually he would be picked up at around 6:30 p.m. from the meetup spot where they would carpool from. And that particular day, his fiancée Jody was supposed to come and pick him up. But when she arrived, she realized that Eric was nowhere to be found and all of the other employees' cars were gone. And since they all rode together, this obviously didn't make a lot of sense. So Eric hadn't called her and told her that he was, going out with anybody or didn't need a ride home or anything. So Jody first called Eric and didn't get a response. So she decided to call a few of his coworkers that they had hung out with a handful of times. They also didn't answer. So at this point, she decided to call his mother, Mary Ellen, to see if she knew something. Mary Ellen immediately told Jody that she didn't know of Eric saying he was going to go anywhere else. For all she knew, he was supposed to be picked up that night. He had already arranged a ride. So she suggested that Jody call police. And then Mary Ellen said she was going to start calling hospitals to see if he was there. They couldn't find him. So at this point, they started calling around to local jails in case something absolutely crazy and offhand happened. They started calling local businesses that he may have been at, but no one had seen him. He wasn't pulling up anywhere. So at this point, his family started trying to look for him. Now, some family members were kind of going between Bismarck and Dickinson, trying to find him along the way. None of the crew had gotten in contact with the family. Mary Ellen was his emergency contact, and the company hadn't called her. So they're thinking, he had all these people with them. They were carpooling together. There's no way something bad could have happened. At least that's what they were hoping. When they called authorities, however, authorities didn't take it seriously at first. Granted, we all know the spiel at this point that if you're an adult, you are very capable of going missing and not wanting anyone to find you, and that's all right. Unless there's something that leads someone to believe something could have happened to you, authorities usually say give it some time. So it wasn't until the following day, the 25th, that they finally were like, look, this is not like him. He hasn't come home. He hasn't contacted anyone. He didn't have a vehicle. He would have had to have been on foot. None of his friends picked him up. These crew members aren't answering our calls. So they finally had him reported as missing. And at this point, his family had already started making up flyers. They went out to the job site themselves and handing these flyers out to people to see if anyone had seen anything. It took 5 days for authorities to question anyone. From my understanding, they spoke to the foreman of the crew first. And this is the man that's basically in charge of everyone, instructs everyone, tells them what to do, keeps them on track, is supposed to be watching all of them. And he said that they started their job that day just fine, that everyone left to go to lunch together. I believe they went to Wendy's. They also went to this tire shop where I guess one of the crew members had left a tire to be fixed. So they went to pick that up, and then they got back to the job site at around noon. The foreman said that he instructed Eric to go into the trench to check the coupling on the pipe for leaks. He was supposed to check to make sure there weren't any tools left down there. This is pretty typical protocol. But then at around 12:14 to 12:15, they began to backfill the hole. And there were 2 operators that were apparently backfilling. Within 15 minutes, he said that they couldn't locate Eric. I guess they waited until around 1 to 1:30-ish to actually call Eric, and they said that he didn't answer. And the foreman said that essentially Eric was very quiet. He didn't really spend a lot of time with the crew, and that he had asked to have some time off for that holiday weekend, but it was denied. So the foreman basically said that he believed Eric just got mad or something and walked off the job site. The rest of the crew, the about 6 or so people, also gave the same exact story for the most part, basically just the final ending that Eric simply walked off. They all said that they went to lunch together, all had the exact same story, and that after lunch, they saw him in the trench, but then he walked off and said he was going to walk to a bank to cash his paycheck. They said that Eric never came back, so they decided to start backfilling the hole and work without him. And then once the day was up, he still hadn't returned, so they grabbed his lunchbox and his backpack and came back to Bismarck without him, and I guess took his items to the headquarters. It was so strange that the entire crew claimed that Eric walked off of this job site without any of his belongings. He left everything behind, but not a single one of them thought to report it to the company. And from that point, the company reported to his emergency contact, which is his mom. Some of them, I guess, had Jody's phone number, so why didn't they call her and why didn't they answer her phone calls? They quite literally just came back with his stuff and did not think to notify anyone that he was just missing. And it became even more strange when his lunchbox and backpack were found, because despite them saying that Eric walked off to cash his paycheck, according to what he said, his paycheck was still in his lunchbox. And also, if he had gotten angry and just walked off of the site like the foreman suggested, he would have changed his clothes. In his backpack, he had a change of shoes and a change of clothes always. He didn't like staying in his dirty clothes when he went anywhere, but he didn't change. He didn't take any of his belongings with him, and he didn't call anyone for a ride, despite the fact that he was an hour and a half away from home and would have needed one. This was not adding up, and as authorities started to look into this case further, it just kept on spiraling. When they pinged Eric's phone, his phone was still pinging from the job site. There was an aerial search that was done on the 30th. There was a ground search that was done on the 30th, but they couldn't locate the phone. Basically, he was pinging at the job site, but nobody could find him. Cell phone records showed that Eric had checked his voicemail for the very last time. So the last time he used his phone was at 12:04, which would have been immediately after getting back from lunch. At 12:14 to 15, again, about 10 minutes later, is when the backfilling began. One thing that was also kind of odd and frightening was the fact that one of the 2 operators that was backfilling had a 5-minute phone call starting at 12:14. So basically, this operator that was backfilling a 6-foot deep hole and should have been fully focused on his job for the safety of himself, for the safety of others, was doing so while having a phone call. They were also able to see that at around 1:13, the foreman did in fact try to call Eric, and then from that point on, everything kind of stopped. This whole situation was so odd from start to finish. And another red flag in this was the fact that Eric was a top groundsman. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with what that means, basically he worked above the dirt. He did not go down in holes usually. He wasn't the one that was working the trenches. He operated a lot of the machinery. He did a lot of things from above ground. So the fact that he was even sent down in the trenches to begin with was not what his typical job was. So why exactly was he sent down there? So on May 30th, the first dig began as well. However, I feel like this was not handled properly because Koffel was participating in the dig. He really gave authorities the blueprints of the job and directed them exactly to where they said they were working. They were like, there's this coupling that he was working on right down here. We'll start digging here and then we'll work our way in this specific direction. So they started this dig, and Mary Ellen the entire time is saying, I know that Eric did not walk off of this job site. Even Jody said he had an issue knowing when to quit and stopping. He was not the kind of person that did that. He, even if he hated the job, would have stayed there, finished it out until he found a new job and then moved on. He was not the kind of person to just walk away in the middle of something like that. Mary Ellen said he is in that ground for sure. She knew it for a fact. So as they are digging and everyone is holding their breath, they find the coupling, they start heading a specific direction. They're drilling holes every 12 inches so that they can bring dogs in. Owner from a construction company across the street approaches authorities and tells them, you are digging in the wrong location. You're supposed to be going the opposite direction. Basically, he said he knew this for a fact because it had caused him a lot of chaos the day that Eric was there working with his crew, the day he went missing. I guess the way that they were actually digging and working that day, the hole was so close to a gravel road that this guy's company used to bring their trucks in and park them in their lot. And the entire day, because the hole was so close to the road, his trucks weren't able to get through. They were having to either go around some crazy way to try to get into the lot. It created a big headache for him that day. So he knew for a fact where they were digging because of how much of a problem it caused. But when he told authorities this, they basically said, mind your business, leave it alone. We have a blueprint. We know exactly where they were digging. Go about your day. So they just kept digging in the wrong direction, as directed by Koffel's employees. So then, a little further into digging, another witness comes up to authorities. This time, it was a resident that lived nearby. He would often sit out on his back porch and drink his coffee while watching the construction going on. And he said, you guys are digging in the wrong direction. So we now have a second person saying, you're going the wrong way. You need to stop. I watched this all happen, but as I can only assume you're guessing, authorities again said, no, don't know what you're talking about. We have blueprints. Go about your day. So they're just digging further and further and further away from where Eric possibly could be. And not just that, they had dug these holes deep in the ground, drilled down about every 12 inches, and they brought in dogs that were supposed to go along these holes to see if they could smell anything. However, they did not bring in the proper dogs. At this point, Eric would have been buried for a week, and you needed to bring in cadaver dogs, but instead they brought in hound dogs. Now, according to Eric's family, the dogs they brought in were not even cadaver dogs, so it was essentially one big waste of time. And if they had brought in cadaver dogs, they may have possibly found him. At the end of that first day, it began to rain, so they ended up having to call off the search for the day, and then they did a second search on the next day. And this day, they called Mary Ellen and told her, we are pretty positive that today is the day we are going to find your son in that ground. Go ahead and call a funeral home, get everything set up for them to accept a body. That is how certain we are that we're going to find him. So Mary Ellen had to make that call. And I cannot even begin to imagine what that was like. She, without even having her son's body yet, without even having answers yet, had to speak to a funeral home to say, hey, I'm going to find my son's body today. I need you to take it. And when she got there, the digging continued, still in the wrong direction. But interestingly, the diggers busted a water line. So as soon as this happened, the second the water line was hit, authorities called off the search. And not just, oh, we can't continue for the day, but we'll come back. They literally were like, oh, we're done, packed up the tape, packed everything up, told Mary Ellen that they already went above and beyond for her, and then left. despite Mary Ellen and all of her family begging authorities to keep digging for him because they knew, especially Mary Ellen, that he had to be there. They literally went from telling his mother that morning, we're going to find your son, call a funeral home, to, oh, we hit a small inconvenience. We could wait a few days and come back, but we're not going to. We're just going to stop searching because we've already done too much for you. Just put yourself in this family's shoes for a minute. They were neglected by every single person involved in this from start to finish, starting at Coffle, ending at the police department. At this point, what the crew members said made absolutely no sense. One of the operators that had done the backfilling out of the two actually wouldn't speak to authorities at all, and he lawyered up. There were employees of this company that made very serious accusations against this operator, saying that he was negligent in every possible way. He worked really fast. He never paid attention when he would do his work. I mean, he was just flinging dirt everywhere. He would backfill super quickly. And basically, they just didn't trust his level of chaos. And essentially, that meant if he was on the phone for 5 minutes while backfilling, that he could have easily backfilled Eric into that hole, not paying attention to what he was doing. Another thing that was brought to the family's attention that really made them worried as well and made Mary Ellen believe even more that her son was buried in the spot he had been working that day was the fact that when authorities got there to search the area where they had been working, where they had backfilled, it had never been tamped down. Now, I'm familiar with this because I do a lot of my own work on my property. I had a dad that was in construction. He was a contractor. I have family that is heating, plumbing, you name it. I've literally played a part in it at some point. And basically, when you dig big holes like this and you fill it back in, there's a lot of airspace that's left over. And so if you don't go behind with a tamp, if it's like a smaller job, or maybe for a job like this, if it was bigger, sometimes you take heavy machinery and you roll it. You see them doing that sometimes on highways. You basically need to compress it and compact the dirt because that empty airspace that could be in there is a huge danger. Someone could walk over it. The loose dirt could just suck them right under. There's so many things that could happen. And they never tamped the dirt that day. It was as if they just covered it up, quickly left, and went home without saying a word. And the family basically ended up finding out that the reason Jody got there and all the cars were gone that day is because they didn't do this. And the boss of the whole operation basically just said, all right, backfill it. We're getting out of here. And they got off work early that day, which create your opinions as you shall, but that's absolutely suspicious in my opinion. Eric's family began to strongly believe that the crew knew something and they weren't handing over this information. Years passed and not a single time in all of those years did Mary Ellen ever say anything other than the fact that her son was buried under that dirt. And I'm gonna try not to cry in this. We know I don't do very well about that. My nose is literally already getting red. But one thing that really hit me, and as a mother, I understand a mother's intuition. And when a mom knows, man, a mom knows. I cannot even explain it unless you're a mom. You can't ever understand it. But she knew he was under there. And she said when it was cold, all she could think about, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't function. All she wanted to do was go and put a blanket on the ground where he last was to keep him warm. When it was hot, she wanted to bring him water. Not a single time did she ever waver from the fact that she knew he was under that ground, and they begged and they pleaded and they tried to get authorities to do something. Unfortunately, by November, literally within just a few months of his disappearance, his case was deemed a cold case. And when this happened, the authorities didn't even call his family to tell them that personally. They only found out that it had been switched to a cold case because they were contacted by an organization out of Texas for their DNA. This company wanted Mary Ellen's DNA and his daughter Bryn's DNA, just in case his remains were ever found anywhere. And when Mary Ellen asked, "Why do you want our DNA? Why has the case been handed over to you?" she found out through them that his case had been labeled a cold case. Nobody would talk to Eric's family. Nobody would listen to them. They were basically just left to figure out what on earth happened and where he was based on a bunch of strange things said by people that should have had his back and should have called someone. And by February of 2015, after absolutely no movement happened in the case, Mary Ellen decided to hire a PI that worked for Discovery Investigations to look into the case. Now, initially, this PI was just investigating on his own. After a couple of months, he found a possible way to dig again at the location of the job site. Now, he apparently had tried to dig there, tried to work with the city, tried to do what he could on his own, and they just didn't want to do it. They did not want to help out. But finally, he figured out that there was going to be another scheduled excavation at that job site to add in drainage. So basically, when this other company had gone in to excavate near the location Eric was last seen, the PI showed up with cadaver dogs. They got a hit, and they went and convinced these two workers from another construction company to move their excavation site and help them dig. And after a while that night, late at night, they found a red glove sticking out of the dirt. It was quite literally less than 10 feet away from where the original dig happened. The PI went down and felt that there was a hand in this glove. And he held the hand and he said, "Hi, Eric. We've been looking for you." And immediately authorities were called onto the scene. They had to treat this scene very delicately. They did not want to disturb the remains too much. They didn't want to potentially lose any evidence. So they basically were out there with brushes, slowly bringing out Eric's body. And one thing that Mary Ellen said was devastating is that the following day she showed up at the site and was begging to go and see Eric, begging to go into the hole or at least watch authorities as they slowly uncovered him. And authorities had the nerve, and I understand where they're coming from because this is literally what they're supposed to say, which is, it is what it is, but they said, "You don't know that this is your son." Literally the exact place his phone had been pinging, the exact place he was last seen in trenches. Who else did they think got buried under there? Finally, by May 21st, 2015, into the 22nd, Eric's remains were fully uncovered. He was 6 feet underground. He was almost perfectly preserved. It was like jumping back to that time 3 years prior. He was still in a crouched position. He still had his clothes on because he was in that amount of dirt. He still had his beard. He still had his tattoos. His clothes were still on him. It was his work clothes that he had worn that day. His measuring tape was still attached to his side. He still had one hand over the pipe. He was literally like on his knees, sitting on his heels with one hand over the pipe, like he was in the middle of inspecting this pipe as dirt was just thrown on top of him. His hard hat had come off, likely by the impact of the dirt on the back of his head, and it had flipped over to the front of his face. And it was devastating. His remains were transported to the University of North Dakota's forensic lab for forensic examination and an autopsy, and they tried to put his remains in the back of a truck with the shovels they used to dig him up. And his mom is the reason that they didn't do that, because she said, "Don't you dare put those tools in there with my son." When they did the autopsy, the things that they had to do are so upsetting that I refuse to even speak about them. There are other podcasts and things that do, but it to me just violated him even further. And I literally just want to hold his mom tight in my arms when I heard what they had to do. They had to do it, from my understanding, to get any information on whether he was stabbed or shot or anything. But he went away in a regular body bag and he came home in an infant body bag, if that tells you anything. They were able to find that his nose was broken. So likely when his hard hat flipped to the front of his face, it hit him so hard that it broke his nose. And they believe it also knocked him out, probably that and the force of the dirt on top of him, because he had no dirt in his lungs, so he never inhaled after that point. Because he had a pacemaker, they were also able to see that he died at 12:19, 5 minutes after the backfilling started, and while one of those individuals backfilling was on the frickin' phone. But ultimately, the cause of death was found to be undetermined. His remains were given back to his family, and like I said, an infant body bag. It was quite literally just a pile of bones with a skull on top, and it was missing his right hand. With no explanation. Nobody knows where his right hand went. It was there when he was in Grand Forks getting an autopsy, but it never came back home. No one could answer any questions about that. And even after his remains were found at his job site, the last known place he was, Koffel never reached out to the family. From the day he went missing for 3 years until he was found, they never reached out. After he was found at their job site, they never reached out. And I was able to find that in 2015, after he was found, they did speak to the Grand Forks Herald. So they posted in a newspaper that they were very sorry that the body was his. But they didn't say it directly to the family. They briefly said this in the article and then spent most of the time fighting for themselves, basically saying, yeah, but we were very cooperative. We did everything we could on our end. It was never a sorry for the family. It was them covering their butts, basically. And that's the most backhanded thing I've seen in a very long time. After his remains were found, authorities did decide to reopen the case as a criminal investigation. They interviewed everyone again, all of the crew members, except from my understanding, they actually didn't interview the same ones. There were only a few of the same ones from the original interviews that were questioned again. I don't know what happened there. There's not been a lot of information released about that. While all of this was going on, the case was also presented to OSHA, but unfortunately, OSHA stated that they have like a 6-month statute of limitations. So since it had been 3 years, their hands were basically tied. However, one of the agents that was working the case said, look, at bare minimum, what happened to Eric was negligence and from complete incompetence. And they also said it was possible that while it could have been an accident, that it's possible this was something that had been done on purpose. And they felt awful that they couldn't help, but that was just all they could do. On August 15th, 2015, Eric's family was finally able to hold a memorial to honor his life. They wrote him messages and were able to finally get some sort of peace. His mother had him cremated because she said there was absolutely no way she could put him in the ground again. Despite the fact that authorities did decide to reopen this as a criminal investigation, it seems like nothing was pretty much done. I would be interested to know what this whole entire crew of 6 people said now that there's no way that he walked off to cash a paycheck. And the thing that's so frustrating about this is that there's quite literally no other explanation. They knew he was down there, or they would have called his family when he went missing. If you're familiar with any work that's similar to this, you work as a team. Like, you are all constantly communicating and working together, and you have a spotter. There's all these different things that are in place to keep people safe, or there should be. And if one of your crew members just goes missing after you've backfilled a hole, it's an emergency. From start to finish, everything was done wrong. This company never should have been in charge of the dig to search for Eric. When they did this, they failed to tell authorities that there were 2 couplings that Eric was going down to check. They had spliced the pipe. They cut it too short, so they spliced it, put 2 couplings on, and that's what he was down there checking. They just said there was 1 coupling because they knew they could lead authorities to that 1 coupling and then go the opposite direction, and they would never question it. They would just think Eric wasn't there. It would prove and corroborate their story. If they said there were 2 couplings, they would have eventually been led the other direction and they would have found Eric. Everything from start to finish was planned to cover this up. There's literally no other way to explain it. Authorities immediately handed the case over to the state attorney, Tom Henning, who looked at it and said there wasn't much that could be done because there just wasn't enough evidence. He said that this didn't mean that he didn't believe something happened here and that there was a crime that occurred, but because there was nothing that directly pointed them to one person, like any direct evidence, he decided that they weren't going to pursue criminal charges, which I will literally repeat this 100 times. How do they know that when they never even figured out what the one main person who possibly could have been involved in? How did they know that when they didn't even question him, when they never tried to contact his lawyer? There was absolutely zero effort that was put into finding out if there was potential evidence or information. After this, local police agreed, and so the case was entirely closed in March of 2016. It has been absolute hell for his family ever since. They were able to get WSI, which is worker safety insurance, only for a brief period of time. Essentially, a payment of $300,000 was supposed to be made to his family. A lot of those payments were supposed to go to his daughter, but when this happened, they were never told the stipulations of the money. They didn't think there would be any. I mean, after all, you literally found this man in a hole he was working in, and no one's holding anyone responsible. No one's even speaking to the crew. The company's not taking any responsibility. They won't even reach out to the family. So you would think at this point, just like at least do what you can for this family. But unfortunately, something fell through. His daughter, one of the stipulations was that she stay in school. But imagine going through 3 to 4 years in school. She was in middle school into high school at this time, with this very small town openly knowing everything that's going on, that your dad was buried alive, that your dad was missing, like all of these things. She had to deal with that in some of the hardest years of your young teen life. And so by the time she was a senior, she couldn't do it anymore. She was done. She was exhausted. She was emotionally drained. So she dropped out because she could not be in that situation anymore. And when she did, the payment stopped. She called the company. She said, what's going on? And they were like, look, you dropped out of high school. And that was one of the stipulations. And so they said, in order to fix it, you have to go back to school. So that's exactly what she did, but the payments never started again. She called to figure out what was going on. They basically said, oh, you never should have been told that. Actually, since you've already dropped out, we will never start your payments ever again. So his family, including his daughter, saw a tiny, tiny fraction of that money. His family has gone to multiple attorneys to try to get something done about this case, to try to hold someone responsible, but because it's this big corporation, this big company, nobody in the entire state wants to touch it, which is mind-blowing. I mean, it doesn't really surprise me because unfortunately, I feel like we see on a daily basis how companies get away with doing such shady, awful things to people, but because these companies are seen as like this big entity instead of seen as, there's people at the top. There are people that you can go to. It's just like the safety bubble they have. And it's like, it doesn't matter what happens within it. These people are just untouchable. Had a few attorneys leave them in the middle of trying to help them, just totally drop them and abandon them and never show back up. They have gone through the ringer, even looking for PIs to help them, PIs that have taken thousands of dollars from them and then ended up investigating them as if they did anything to him. It's just been an absolute nightmare for the family. And to this day, they are just told there is absolutely nothing they can do. And his daughter has said multiple times, you think it would be enough that his body was found in the hole he was working in, but it's just not. Now, there have been OSHA violations against them in the past for negligence. So there is even a history of these issues. But because they can't prove anything with Eric's death, they won't do anything. Information from my brother-in-law on all the things that should have been done and all of the ways that this company failed Eric and failed to keep him safe, therefore negligently caused his death. Now, first and foremost, at a large job like this, at least in North Carolina, again, laws vary. Any trench that is dug 4 feet or more needs shoring equipment. And shoring equipment is basically these big walls that they put in, and then they put a hydraulic press in the middle. Because when you have dirt dug that deep, it is possible that the trench will try to cave in on itself. That can bury someone alive. So to prevent it, you have this shoring that is put in. Now, when you have the shoring put in order to get it out, you usually need 2 people. You need someone in the trench that, takes off the hydraulics, passes it up, passes up the walls to a second person standing above it. Clearly, we're not using shoring equipment, which again, it may not have been required for this job in this particular state. I'm not sure of their laws, so if you know, let me know down below. But basically, there's no way they had been using shoring equipment because someone, A, would have known he was still in the hole because he would have been there passing things up. Also doesn't make sense because of his positioning. He wasn't helping get these different pieces of shoring equipment out. He was leaning over the pipe still trying to fix it. So to me, that says there was no shoring equipment there. It wasn't pulled out by one person in the course of 5 minutes that he was backfilled over and died because they would have seen him. Also, when you have a hole of that size or a trench of that size, again, in North Carolina, I'm going to stop prefacing it with that after this point because I've made it clear, I think. But there's a spotter. The operator from where they are in the heavy machinery, they can't see very well if there's something down there or something going wrong. So there's usually a spotter that is there to make sure there's nothing underneath the dirt as it is being backfilled in. There clearly was not someone doing that, or Eric would not have been covered up. The foreman, who's supposed to be in charge of all of this and monitoring it all, didn't notice till an hour later that he was missing and didn't try to call him until an hour later. So where was he this entire hour that Eric was gone? Very possible he just didn't know, but again, that just shows he wasn't paying attention to what was happening on his job site, which is a work safety hazard. Another thing that is a big issue is the fact that operators typically before doing anything, again, backfilling a hole, are supposed to walk the trench or the hole a couple of times to make sure all the tools are out, to make sure there's no trash. It's just kind of proper practices, make sure there's, no people in it. And clearly the operator didn't do this either. The operator also was on his phone while backfilling. We have the proof of it. He, I guess, tried to say that he wasn't on his phone. He wouldn't do that while on the job, but we have the evidence from his cell phone records that he was. So it's crazy to me that despite all of this, no one can do anything. I mean, how would you ever prove that unless there was video footage of them not doing things right? I mean, you can look at what happened and know things weren't done right. So I don't understand how that's not evidence enough. There are a lot of different theories about what exactly happened out there. There are a lot of people that believe that this was done on purpose. From what I've seen, his mom seems to be pretty open-minded about what happened. His daughter said she believes that it was more than likely just an accident. I personally don't know enough about the situation to really give my full say. I don't know why anyone purposely would have done this to Eric. I don't know what Eric could have possibly done, given the fact that everyone said he was just a very kind and outgoing person and he loved to work. I know he didn't slack off on the job and irritate people or do anything that would have made someone want to harm him. So unless there's something I'm missing or an authorities are missing and the family is missing, I don't know how likely it is that someone did it on purpose. Now, from what I am seeing and what has basically been said by the crew members afterwards, I honestly think it's very likely that this was just an accident. Obviously, this operator does not need to be in the job he is in. If he's going to be on the phone while backfilling, if he's known to be hazardous while working and just trying to get things done as fast as possible, he does not need to be backfilling 6-foot deep holes that his crew members frequently are in and out of. I think they got back from lunch. The foreman maybe quickly sent Eric down because he was who was near the trench or available to go and check things out. And the operator basically just wasn't paying attention and possibly covered him up. And maybe they realized after a while, hey, we don't know where Eric is. And again, in order to save themselves because they were on probation or, something was going on, they decided to make up some elaborate lie that he just walked off. Because authorities took 5 days to question the employees, that essentially gave them 5 days to come up with the same story. I honestly don't think everyone on that crew knew what happened. I think the foreman probably didn't know what was going on. He didn't seem to be very attentive, if I'm being real honest. But I feel like at least a few of them knew we buried him. Oh my God, what are we going to do? And so they rushed out of work and left and kind of all got together and created a story. But again, even if it was an accident, it was due to negligence on the crew's part, on the company's part, and I think they all knew it, and that's why nobody reached out to the family. And the fact that no one's been charged and they are just going on their merry way. Now, there is a GoFundMe that is currently up and running. The family uses the GoFundMe to cover legal costs. They're still desperately trying to find an attorney or someone that can help them. Awareness is everything. There could be an attorney out there that would tackle this case in a heartbeat and help this family, and they just don't know about it to go and help. And that's where social media can do absolutely amazing things and hopefully get this story in the hands of the right person and the right resources that can absolutely change this family's life and how this case has been handled this entire time. There is a Facebook page that you can go and follow so that you are constantly updated. They're incredibly active on the Facebook page. His daughter has done a live video of what she remembers of what happened and trying to answer questions. There's a bunch of different comments from his mother and things that she believes, theories that are bouncing around. They post ways that you can help. They do a lot of different fundraisers that you can assist with. It's just a really great way to figure out how you can be actively helping this family, not just by watching this video, but by continuously supporting them after the fact. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Eric's story. If you have any information on this case, if you are a crew member or a crew member spoke to you, if you have anything at all, I will make sure to leave any contact information down below so that you can get that information to the right individuals. Even though they did decide to not pursue criminal charges, I know that they did say that didn't mean they would never look into it again. They just need more information in order to pursue the case any further. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below. Go ahead and do so you can become a part of the Hallen fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.